Hello and welcome to part 2 of this series of short videos expanding on the core low-intensity CBT interventions that PWPs use with their patients. My name's Josh Cable, and over the last 7 years I've worked in a variety of roles within IAPT, including as a PWP, supervisor PWP, Step 2 lead, and more recently as a lecturer on PWP training programs at a number of high-profile UK universities. I created these videos as tools to support PWP's understanding of the core Step 2 interventions. This is not intended to replace your university training, but supplement your understanding in an easy to digest format. Today we are focusing on cognitive restructuring, sometimes referred to as thought challenging, a CBT-based treatment for depression. In a nutshell, cognitive restructuring claims that by challenging our negative thoughts and creating more balanced, realistic alternatives, we can improve our mood. The first step of any treatment intervention should be psychoeducation, and what you're doing here is supporting the patient to understand the symptoms that they're currently experiencing. I think that good treatment psychoeducation should always contain two elements. One, why the patient is feeling this way, and more importantly, why the symptoms aren't going away on their own. This is where the ABC model and vicious cycle that we'll discuss shortly come in. Two, how we're going to support this patient to break their vicious cycle. In essence, this is your rationale for how treatment will work. So let's start with that first bit, why the patient is feeling this way. At assessment, you should have given the patient an overview of CBT and the ABC model, but it's worth briefly going back over this now, as it may have been a number of weeks or even months since the patient's assessment. As a side note, I'll be discussing the ABC model in this video as this is the model that I teach my students. However, I realise that some people watching this may have been taught the 5 areas model instead. In reality, it doesn't actually matter which you've been taught, as both models serve the same function. The main difference is that whilst the 5 areas model has a box for the patient to input their emotions, the ABC model formulates that the emotion comes as a result of the links between the A, B and C symptoms. Basically, both models conclude that the emotion is linked to these core symptoms, but the 5 areas model does it in a more overt way. For the purposes of this video, all the explanations, models, cycles, etc. will be relevant regardless of which model you use, as we're still talking about how the A's, B's and C's are linked together. I won't go into a generic introduction to CBT today, as this would be the same across all interventions, but this should lead into a discussion of the ABC model. Within this discussion, you need to support the patient in understanding which of their symptoms go into which area of the model, and also how these areas are linked together. And you can see that a patient is doing this now. It's more collaborative to elicit these symptoms from the patient rather than telling them what was said at assessment. And make sure you allow the patient to explore which area of the model each symptom should fit into, rather than simply telling them. Whilst any patient engaging in CBT-based treatment needs to understand that their symptoms are linked together, for cognitive restructuring it's particularly important for patients to understand specifically how their thoughts can impact how they feel physically, what they do or don't do, and ultimately their mood. This is termed as the power of thoughts. There are many examples out there to illustrate this, but one I like to use is of a dog. Imagine 2 people are walking down the street and a dog approaches them. One sees the dog and has a positive thought, such as that dog is cute. Imagine you had that thought. How do you think you'd feel physically? What would you do? This person will likely feel happy or excited and may stroke or interact with the dog. Imagine another person sees the same dog, but their thought is that dogs are dangerous. This thought leads to a completely different set of physical symptoms and behaviours, and in this case the person may feel anxious and on edge, leading them to avoid the dog. The thing to take away from this example is that the stimulus, trigger, situation, whatever you want to call it, was the same. It was the same dog. The only difference was the thought the patient had in response to the dog. It was as a result of the positive or negative thought that the patient felt a certain way physically and behaved in a certain way. In essence, the thought was the thing that caused the change in the other symptoms, and this demonstrates the power our thoughts can have over our mood. This is important because it means that by targeting the patient's depressive thoughts, we can impact the rest of their depressive symptoms. Once the patient is happy with how the different areas of the ABC model are linked together, as well as the power of thoughts analogy, it's time to move on to discuss their vicious cycle. Within CBT, these vicious cycles illustrate what is maintaining the mental health issue. This feeds into the rationale for the intervention, as we can then discuss how we're going to break the cycle using a CBT-based technique. Here is an example cycle of how negative thinking can maintain depression. At the top is an example of a negative thought, and you should elicit this from the patient to be more collaborative. This leads into the next box, which is that the patient believes the thought to be true. What we know from our discussion earlier is that our thoughts have a clear impact on how we feel physically, how we behave, and ultimately our mood. What this results in is that if we have a negative thought, such as I am worthless, this is likely going to negatively impact our mood. However, there's a caveat to this. In order for the thought to negatively impact our mood, we must believe that it's true. And what we know is that people who are depressed are more likely to believe negative thoughts to be true than people who are not depressed. More on this later. Imagine you're already feeling low, and you then have a thought that you're worthless. If you really believe that this is true, you can easily see how this would make you feel even lower, which you'll see is the next part of the cycle. What then happens is because you're now feeling even lower than before, you're even more likely to believe future negative thoughts to be true. So we have this cycle where you feel low, so you believe the negative thought to be true, which makes you feel even lower, which means you're even more likely to believe the next negative thought to be true, which makes you feel even lower, and so on. This is the vicious cycle that the patient could be caught in, which is maintaining their depression. When discussing this model, ensure you're using questions to aid the guided discovery approach. Remember, we should be supporting patients, not lecturing them. As an example, I might say to the patient, this model shows that believing those negative thoughts can make you feel worse. Why do you think that is? Cognitive restructuring is a cognitive intervention, as you may have guessed from the name, meaning we're targeting the patient's thoughts. And as we know from the basis of CBT, once we break one area of the vicious cycle, the whole cycle starts to break down. But how do we break this cycle? Well, the rationale for cognitive restructuring is that by supporting the patient to challenge their negative thoughts, their mood should improve. In other words, if they have a negative thought, but instead of believing it to be true, they challenge it, it won't have as much of a negative impact on their mood. This means that they'll be in a better position to challenge future negative thoughts and stop themselves getting trapped in the vicious cycle we just discussed. What the patient needs to understand is that the thing keeping this vicious cycle going is their belief that the negative thought is true, and therefore by supporting the patient to challenge these thoughts rather than believe them, the cycle will break down. So let's imagine that your patient has a good understanding of the ABC model, vicious cycle, and rationale for cognitive restructuring. The next step of the intervention is to discuss negative thinking. Research tells us that human beings have approximately 60 to 80,000 thoughts per day, and most of these we won't even notice. With this many thoughts, it's completely natural for some of them to be negative. Another natural part of our thinking as human beings is that we tend to not question our thoughts, most of the time believing them to be true without hesitation. But just because we've had a thought, it doesn't necessarily make it true. This is an important concept that we'll refer back to throughout treatment. Can you remember a time when you had a disagreement with someone else? In the moment, you probably believed that you were 100% correct. However, later on, you may have found out that what you were saying was completely wrong. For instance, you and a friend may be arguing about when the moon landing happened. You may think it happened in 1970, and in the moment you completely believed that thought to be true. Your friend may say it was 1969, which is actually the right answer. In this example, even though you were wrong the whole time, it didn't stop you believing wholeheartedly that your thought was true. So we have two important concepts here. One, it's normal to have negative thoughts. And two, we tend to believe our thoughts to be true, even when not depressed. This means that when we are depressed, those negative thoughts become even more compelling. This leads us on nicely to the concept of negative automatic thoughts, NATs, or NATs for short. Negative automatic thoughts are, as I'm sure you've gathered, thoughts which are negatively focused and occur automatically throughout our lives. Sometimes these thoughts can occur as a result of a trigger, but other times they can seem to occur out of nowhere. The automatic part of the name simply refers to how we do not have control over whether we have them or not. Everyone, regardless of age, gender, race, or mental health, experiences NATs. They are a normal part of life and how our brain functions, and it's important that you normalise this. NATs are different to worries though. Whereas worries are anxiety based and tend to be focused on future events, for example, what if I'm late, NATs are negative thoughts about the patient or the world around them. For example, I'm useless, I'm rubbish at my job, or I'm a bad parent are all examples of negative automatic thoughts. As mentioned previously, when a thought comes into our heads, our default position is to believe it to be true. However, the key difference between someone who is depressed and someone who isn't is that the person who isn't depressed is much more likely to be able to recognize the negative thought and challenge that it is not true. Just to repeat this as it's key, the difference between people who are depressed and those who aren't is not that the non-depressed people don't have negative thoughts. It's that the people who are depressed are more likely to believe them to be true. For instance, if the thought that I'm a terrible teacher popped into my head, I could likely rationalize this and recognize that in reality it's probably not the case. However, if someone who is depressed had this thought, they're more likely to believe it is true, leading to the negative impact on their mood that we discussed earlier. Not only are depressed patients more likely to believe their negative thoughts to be true, research shows that they're more likely to spend time focusing on them. You may remember earlier I said that most of our 60 to 80,000 thoughts a day we don't even notice. And for people who are not depressed, we may not even recognize some of our negative thoughts. And if we do, it's likely an automatic process to challenge them. On the other hand, patients who are depressed can engage in a process called rumination, where they spend time and effort focusing in on their negative thinking. A process which, as you can imagine, leads to them feeling even lower. To summarize what's been covered so far, at this stage in treatment, the patient needs to understand 1. What CBT is and how it applies to them using the ABC model or 5 areas model. 2. Their vicious cycle, how the power of thoughts feeds into this and how CR will aim to break this cycle. And 3. What negative automatic thoughts are and why we tend to believe them by default. Assuming the patient is happy with everything so far, you would move on to the next step of cognitive restructuring, identifying thoughts. The purpose of this step is to support the patient to learn how to identify and record the negative thoughts that they experience, but also to start to recognize the impact on their mood that these thoughts have. This is a skill in itself, and so requires time and practice to master. To support the patient with this, they'll complete a thought diary. Here you can see an example that I created, however there are many others available on the internet. Just make sure that the one you're using contains these 3 columns. The first column is the situation. Here the patient should record everything that is going on around them at the time of the nap, and they can do this by thinking of the 4 W's. What are they doing? Where are they? Who are they with? What time is it? This column is helpful as it can identify triggers for their negative thinking, which could potentially be discussed later in treatment. The next column is for the patient to record the feeling that they had at the time of the negative automatic thought. Did they feel sad, low, anxious, scared? They would then rate the intensity or strength of this emotion, with 0% being that they're not feeling it at all, and 100% being the strongest they've ever experienced that emotion. So for instance, a rating of 100% for sad would mean that it was the saddest the patient has ever felt. The last column is where the patient records their negative thought. In essence, when they were in this situation, feeling this way, what went through their head? They should try to be honest and as specific as possible about this thought. They should also record how strongly they believed that thought to be true, with 0% being no belief at all, and 100% meaning it is undeniably true. One thing to note with this, the belief rating should be a reflection of how strongly they believed the thought to be true when they had it, not if they're reflecting on it at a later time. For instance, a patient may believe that they are useless 100% in the moment, but later on they may be able to reflect and rationalize it down to 50%. In this case, 100% is what they would record in the diary, as this is how strongly they believed the thought to be true at the time of having it. Remember when exploring the thought diary to be collaborative. So for instance, before jumping in to explain why the situation column is important, I might ask the patient, why do you think it's helpful to record the situation in which you had the negative thought? It is good practice to go through an example or two in this diary together within the session to check the patient's understanding. They would then keep the diary as their between session work, recording every negative thought they notice over the week or 2-week period. They should continue noting down their NATs even if they experience the same NAT multiple times. So the patient's gone away and kept a thought diary for homework and come to the next session with a list of their negative thoughts. This is built on their ability to identify negative thoughts, but the other skill they need alongside this is to analyze their thoughts. Within this step, you'll be supporting the patient to identify unhelpful thinking styles and their hot thought. It should be noted that the order of this step and the last one are interchangeable and completely depend on the patient, their motivation, and how much insight they have into their negative thinking. For patients who really get the ABC model and rationale for the intervention, you may introduce unhelpful thinking styles and hot thoughts before setting the thought diary as homework, meaning that the patient is both recording their NATs in the thought diary and analysing their thoughts between sessions. Alternatively, for other patients, you may follow the structure we've discussed here, where you do your psychoed in the first session, the patient then keeps a thought diary between sessions, and then in session 2 you introduce hot thoughts and unhelpful thinking styles. There's no right way of doing it, and it completely depends on the patient you're working with. Some may find it makes more sense to do both at the same time, whilst others may feel overwhelmed if you're covering the ABC model, psychoed, the thought diary, hot thoughts, and unhelpful thinking styles in the first session. You may also find that you run out of time in your first treatment session before you can cover hot thoughts. In this case, it can be good to set the thought diary as homework and then return to hot thoughts in your next session. For the sake of this example, we're assuming that we stopped at introducing the thought diary last session. The patient has then come to this session with a completed thought diary, and what we're now going to do is help them to analyse their thoughts. As mentioned before, there are two key elements to analysing NATs: hot thoughts and unhelpful thinking styles. A hot thought is the thought which is most closely linked to the depression. In essence, it's the thought which is causing them the most distress or is most likely maintaining the vicious cycle we discussed earlier. When trying to identify which NAT is their hot thought, the patient can look for three things in particular. 1. Which NAT occurs most often? 2. Which NAT has the highest belief percentage? And 3. Which NAT is most linked to a negative change in mood? It's important to stress to the patient that these 3 points are simply guides to help them find their hot thought. The hot thought itself doesn't have to meet all 3 of these criteria. For example, you could have a NAT which occurs 10 times over a week period, but the belief percentage is only 40%. Alternatively, you could have another NAT which only occurs twice over the same period, but the belief percentage is 100% and it results in a significant negative emotion. In this case, this second thought is more likely to be the hot thought, despite occurring less often. So if we go back to our thought diary, you can see that we have multiple contenders for the hot thought. The first thought has the highest belief percentage, but the second thought has the strongest negative emotion. In this case, the patient would decide what they feel their hot thought is, and in reality, either of these two examples would work perfectly. At this stage, you just want to make sure that the patient understands what a hot thought is. Something else you should explore with the patient is why we want to identify hot thoughts, and you can ask the patient if they have any idea why this is in order to include them in the discussion. The reason we want to find the hot thought is because this is likely the thought, or one of the thoughts, which is keeping the vicious cycle going. Therefore, if the patient challenges this thought, it's likely to lead to a positive shift in their mood. The other reason we focus on the hot thought is because this is the thought which is likely impacting the patient the most and will therefore often be the most difficult to challenge. If you support the patient to successfully challenge their hot thought within your sessions, then they should be able to challenge the less impactful NATs on their own with relative ease. The other aspect of analysing the patient's negative thoughts is helping them to look for unhelpful thinking styles, sometimes called cognitive distortions. Rather than thinking about individual NATs, these are more generalised patterns of thinking which many NATs might fall under. Think of these as a mental filter. These are patterns of thinking which we engage in that often support our NATs whilst discounting events or incidents which could prove them to be untrue. These patterns of thinking have a significant impact on our mood, and the first step towards breaking them is to recognise that they are occurring. There are many types of unhelpful thinking styles, so I'd recommend doing some further reading on this. However, a few common examples include mind reading, black and white thinking, and overgeneralizing. Mind reading is the belief that we know what others are thinking, and we make conclusions based on this. For example, saying that someone thinks we are lazy or doesn't want to spend time with us. Black or white thinking is the belief that everything is either perfect or completely awful. There is no middle ground. For instance, someone may have made a beautiful cake, but if they make the slightest mistake on one part of the decoration, they may claim that the whole cake is ruined. Finally, overgeneralizing is where the patient takes a negative example and applies this to all similar situations, even where it's not relevant. For example, someone who fails one submission on the PWP program may think that they are a failure or will be an awful PWP, but they're not considering all of the other assignments that they may have passed. Once you've explored some unhelpful thinking styles, you would support the patient to examine if they're engaging in any of these. If we return to the thought diary, you can see that the patient is exhibiting a number of unhelpful thinking styles. For instance, I'm terrible at my job is an example of overgeneralizing. One mistake has led them to conclude they're terrible at their job. Similarly, they don't like me anymore is an example of mind reading. How does the patient know their friend doesn't like them anymore? You don't have to go through every nat in their diary, but it's helpful here to support the patient to identify any patterns emerging. Before you move forward with the intervention, you need to ensure that the patient clearly understands and is happy with the psychoeducation and rationale you completed in your first session, what negative automatic thoughts are, or NATs, and how to identify them using a thought diary, and how to identify hot thoughts and unhelpful thinking styles. Remember to use questions to elicit this understanding in a collaborative manner. For instance, I might ask a patient, just to check we're on the same page, would you be able to tell me what an unhelpful thinking style is? So at this stage in treatment, we can assume that the patient has completed their thought diary and they've identified that it's my fault they argue I'm a bad child is their hot thought. The next step of cognitive restructuring is to support the patient to look for evidence for and against their hot thought. This will help the patient to start to see their NATs through a more balanced perspective. This is often known as taking the thought to court. The reason for this analogy is because it reminds the patient that when we're looking for evidence for and against our thoughts, we should only take factual evidence into account. If you imagine, in a courtroom, lawyers are only allowed to present facts to the jury. Guesses, opinions, or gossip can't be admitted into evidence. And it's the same with this step of the intervention. You'll need to support the patient to see how only factual evidence should be considered when evaluating their NATs. You should discuss with the patient the difference between factual evidence and non-factual evidence. For instance, a patient might write down that people think they're boring as evidence for their hot thought that nobody likes them. However, this is likely not factual evidence. It's an example of mind reading. The patient is guessing what other people are thinking rather than stating facts. Another example could be a patient who says they're always making mistakes as evidence for the hot thought that they're bad at their job. But are they actually always making mistakes? Likely they may have made one or even two mistakes, but it's unlikely that they are making mistakes all the time, which would again mean that this isn't factual evidence. Within this step of the treatment, we would use an evidence recording sheet, which you can see is split into 4 sections. Firstly, the patient would write their hot thought into the box. Next, they would write their belief percentage next to this. This should be taken directly from the thought diary, and in this case it would be 90%. Next, the patient would come up with as much evidence for the thought as they can think of. In other words, what is the evidence that this thought is true? Your role here is to facilitate this process, primarily by ensuring that all of the evidence the patient lists is actually factual. For instance, in this case the patient has written that they always let their parents down, but this is unlikely to be factual. If this was a fact, it would mean that absolutely everything the patient does lets her parents down. You could challenge the patient here and ask, how do you know you're always letting them down? Or are you sure that everything you do lets them down? This will hopefully support the patient to see that this is not the case and therefore the evidence isn't factual. Instead, they may come up with a more factual piece of evidence, such as, my dad told me once that I'd let him down after I got caught truanting from school. This is a fact, it happened. It could be argued as to whether this is actually evidence that she was a bad child. I mean, does letting your parents down make you a bad child? However, for the sake of this example, we'll accept this as factual evidence. Finally is the evidence against box, and it's natural for the patient to struggle here. Remember what we discussed earlier around how we tend to believe our thoughts to be true. This is why we can struggle to come up with evidence against them. To start with, keep this process open. Just wait and see if the patient can come up with any factual evidence against their hot thought. If the patient struggles with this process, you can support them with something called cross-questioning. These are questions that the patient can ask themselves to help build up evidence against their negative thoughts. Within this session, you can ask the patient these questions to help them out, but the hope is that in the future, they'd be able to ask themselves these questions to help generate this evidence against their NATs. Some good examples of these questions are, if you told a good friend about this thought, what would they say? Or if a friend told you that they'd had this thought, what would you say to them? In most cases, we're much nicer to our friends than to ourselves. So if a friend told us that they felt useless, our first reaction would often to be to tell them that they aren't useless and give them reasons why this is the case. This type of question should help the patient to start doing this for themselves. Another example of role swapping could be to ask the patient, if you were the PWP and I was the patient, and I said this thought to you, what would you say back to me? You could also ask, if you weren't feeling low and you had that thought, would you think it was true? Why or why not? And finally, one of the most effective ways to produce evidence against is to ask about the belief percentage, and importantly, why it's not 100%. For example, if the patient rated their belief as 85%, you could say to them, you said that you 85% believed that thought to be true, but this leaves 15% of you that didn't believe it was true. What makes up that 15%? Or alternatively, you could ask, why did you not believe that thought 100%? Obviously, this only works if the patient hasn't rated their belief percentage as 100% to begin with. You should encourage the patient to practice using these questions within the session, and you can see here that our patient is coming up with examples of evidence which contradicts that they are a bad child. You'll work through this process with the patient's hot thought within the session, and then the patient can finish this and start applying it to other NATs as between session work. The last step of cognitive restructuring is to reconsider the hot thought in light of the evidence gathered in the previous step. We do this to produce more balanced or realistic thoughts. Remember what we discussed at the beginning around the power of thoughts. Overly negative thoughts maintain our negative mood. If instead of having these negative thoughts, we have more balanced thoughts, then our mood isn't going to be as negatively impacted. However, it could be easy to say by this logic that if negative thoughts equals sadness or unhappiness or low mood, then positive thoughts equals happiness, right? Well, no, this isn't the case, as it's not realistic to expect someone to think positively all the time. Think back to a time when you felt low. How would you have felt if someone said to you something along the lines of, think happy thoughts? With cognitive restructuring, the aim is not to make the patient always think positively, it's about thinking realistically. Part of thinking realistically is this balance between positive thoughts and negative thoughts, which we all have, and CR can help people suffering with depression to get back to this balance. In this final step of CR, we take the original hot thought, consider the evidence for and against the thought that we gathered in the last step, and then see if there's a more balanced way of looking at this. To do this, we use the same thought diary that we looked at earlier, but you'll notice there are a couple of extra columns that we didn't previously discuss. These are for the revised thought at the end. You can see here how the patient has recorded their original hot thought that it's her fault that her parents argue because she's a bad child. But then using their evidence for and against, they've revised this to, sometimes people argue, but just because I haven't always done the right thing doesn't make me a bad child. You'll notice that this isn't overly positive. It isn't saying that she's the best child ever, but it's more realistic thought based on the factual evidence. The important thing to notice is the change in mood associated with this thought. The new thought still produces some low mood, which is completely natural, but you can see that it does not result in them feeling as low as they did with the original thought. This is in essence how CR should work for them moving forwards. By revising their NATs into more balanced alternatives, the patient should experience an improvement in their mood. Again, think back to the power of thoughts analogy. To give you another example, if we use the thought I mentioned earlier about being a bad teacher, if I had that NAT, I could record it on a thought diary, come up with evidence for and against it, and then reach a more balanced alternative. This might be something like, although I may not be everyone's favourite teacher, this doesn't make me bad at my job. Hopefully you can see how my mood is going to be lower if I think I'm a bad teacher compared to if I think the revised thought instead. You should try to work through at least one example of this process with the patient within the session, and then the patient will continue practicing for homework. Again, remember to be collaborative. The revised thought should be coming from the patient, not from you. Your role is to facilitate this process using questions to support the patient and guide them, rather than giving answers. Before you end this session, it's important to reinforce some key things to the patient. 1. Change takes time and practice. Rewriting patterns of negative thinking doesn't happen overnight. This is something they should be practicing on a daily basis and will require ongoing practice. 2. If they're really struggling to find evidence against their hot thought at first and cross-questioning isn't helping, they could ask a family member or trusted friend to help them look for evidence against. However, this should only be a short-term aid. 3. The patient should continue working in the structured format using the provided worksheets until they become proficient in the process. Over time, this will likely become an automatic process where they can challenge their NATs without needing to write them down and physically work through them. But until this point, it's important that they maintain the structure. You've now covered all of the steps of the cognitive restructuring intervention, and the patient would continue practicing this full process as homework. From now on, every time the patient has a NAT, they'll write it down in a thought diary. They'll then use the evidence recording worksheet to explore evidence for and against that thought, before finally returning to the thought diary and reconsidering the thought into a more balanced alternative. Finally, they should reflect on the impact this process has had on their mood. One last point is that whilst we discussed previously that it takes time and practice for cognitive restructuring to start working, there are some instances where it may not be effective. Beck describes core beliefs as the deepest level of cognition, thoughts that represent enduring attitudes about the self, others, or the world around them. These tend to develop as a result of early life experiences and could include thoughts such as everyone rejects me or the world is a dangerous place. These thoughts are ingrained too deeply for cognitive restructuring alone to prove effective and would likely require a step up for high intensity CBT. If you're ever concerned about a possible core belief, discuss with your supervisor. On a more step 2 note, you may find some patients that understand the CR intervention and see some improvement, but need a bit of extra support to help them create revised thoughts that they actually truly believe in. In this case, a technique called behavior experiments could be used to physically test out thoughts. However, this is a post-qualification technique and is not covered in the core PWP training. Another video in this series will cover that intervention. We've now covered the full cognitive restructuring intervention, but before we finish, let's summarize the key steps that we've discussed today. Remember that the pace in which you move through these steps should be dictated by the patient's understanding and ability. This is not a strict session-by-session plan. Step 1 is psychoeducation, covering the ABC model, power of thoughts analogy, vicious cycle, and rationale for the intervention. Step 2 is introducing the concept of NATs. Step 3 is to support the patient with how to use a thought diary to identify their negative thoughts. Step 4 is to help the patient to analyze these thoughts and identify the presence of a hot thought and any unhelpful thinking styles. Step 5 is to look for evidence for and against the hot thought and support the patient with the cross-questioning process. And lastly, step 6 is for the patient to revise their hot thought into a more balanced, realistic alternative. Then for the rest of your sessions, you'll support the patient to repeat the process of identifying thoughts, gathering evidence, and then revising them, troubleshooting any issues if they come up. You'll end your last session with some form of relapse prevention, but that's for another video. I hope this video has helped develop your knowledge of the cognitive restructuring intervention and will assist you in treating patients with depression in your clinical practice. If you're interested in other videos like this, then you should watch the rest of this video series, focusing on behavior activation, worry management, exposure therapy, and more. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day.